Hi, everybody. This is Sherry Jost, and I'm very proud to represent the Voice of the Customer chapter today. And we're happy to present this webinar on risk with one of our customers, Mark Mullally from Abbvie, and one of Abbvie's suppliers on risk, the NeoGroup, and two representatives, Atul and John. So first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the Voice of the Customer chapter. We're unique because we are customer only, and we're a virtual chapter because our customers are everywhere. There's no way we could have a geographical meeting. So we encourage you to join us if you're a customer and you want to stay abreast of the customer side of the industry. And we do this either with customer-only webinars or webinars where we have a customer along with their supplier on a topic to help give more meat to the topic and how the customer is tackling that topic at their company. We have a leadership team of about 10 people who are customers in the industry, and they collaborate. We have about 8 team meetings a year, and we manage the Voice of the Customer chapter. So each year we sponsor 4 events, 1 per quarter. The first one, which hopefully some of you have attended, is on Monday morning of the Outsourcing World Summit. This is a customer-only session with roundtable discussions. The leadership team picks 4 or 5 leading-edge topics, and you're at a table with around 8 other customers with discussion on how do you handle this at your company? Do you have any advice for me? What are the pitfalls? I have found that one to be extremely helpful in all the years that I've attended the Outsourcing World Summit. So I hope to see you join us there in February on Monday morning. It's well worth it coming in Sunday night to attend that session. In the second quarter this year, we had a webinar on robotics from a customer implementation standpoint. What are the pitfalls, lessons learned, what to be careful for in RPA? Very timely topic. And today we're happy to present the risk webinar, and we'll have a webinar in fourth quarter, so please look out for the IAOP messages to announce that. Just so you know where we get our topics, we get them from you, customers. We want to know what's on your mind. What do you need help with? Who would you like to hear from? What discussion would you like to have? So your input drives our chapter. To that end, I encourage you to send your questions to, I'll be glad to take them, and we'll make sure that my address, email address, and telephone number are distributed after this meeting. Now, we're real pleased that the NeoGroup, who will be presenting on today's webinar, they offer a benefit to IAOP corporate members with a certain level of access to their product, Supply Wisdom. I think after you see the webinar, you'll definitely want to get an ID for that access, and there will be a demo November 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to show you how to get started to use the tool. So why don't you mark that on your calendar, November 6th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and you'll learn how to get an ID and how to get started with Supply Wisdom. So without further ado, let's start today's webinar of real-time and continuous risk monitoring, modernizing supply risk. This was a topic that was asked for during the roundtables this year. Our speakers today are Mark Mullally from Abbvie. He's the Senior Manager of Risk and Vendor Performance in their Outsourcing COE. And we're happy to have the NeoGroup, who partners with Mark, Atul Vashistha, who's the CEO of the NeoGroup, and Bree from NeoGroup. One last point is that you can ask questions. We want to make this an interactive webinar. I think it helps if you ask your questions during the hour so that they're pertinent and you don't have to wait till the end. And you can do that through your browser. So please send your questions and let's make this interactive. Atul?
Great. Thank you, Sherry. Hi, everybody. I also, before we begin, I just want to make a plug for the IAOP governance chapter. This topic has been near and dear to the governance team, and we have covered this topic also on the governance chapter. So if you want to take a look at some of the older webinars, you will find this topic having been addressed. Now, what we're addressing today is different. What we are focusing on, when Sherry talked to us about the Voice of the Customer chapter and the request that came in, the focus of this is, we're going to begin with why risk matters. I think it sounds obvious, but we want to talk about some of the changes that we are seeing. When I say we, it's, John Bree comes from a background, he led third-party oversight at Deutsche Bank and before that at Citi, and did that not just from the US, but also living in the UK, Japan, Singapore, so seen it globally. And then Mark has made a career out of this, and Mark has deep expertise in this area, experience at Abbott and now at Abbvie, a multi-billion-dollar company that operates in over 150 countries. Then we talk about what risks matter. Often we see people really limited in their thinking about risk. And then we'll walk through risk management models, approaches, and solutions. As we are going through it, please feel free to ask questions. So you can do it through chat. You can ask a question, and we as a group will try to address it. And Sherry, I'm sure, will interrupt us at that point in time to do that. So let's start with why risk matters. Of course, the moment we think about it, we think about disruptions. But the important thing to recognize is that we are seeing that the number of incidents are going up rapidly. This was a survey that was done in 2016 by Deloitte to third-party governance and risk managers, and 87% had faced a disruption with their third parties in the last 2 to 3 years. 87%, of which 28% had faced a major disruption. And of all the disruptions, 11% actually experienced a complete third-party failure, And so when in the survey, when the executives were asked, what level of confidence do you have in your third-party risk programs, 94.3% had low to moderate. That's not a good sign. John, when in your experience, when you were doing this at banks, Deutsche Bank, Citi, and others, did you see similar challenges in terms of lack of preparedness?
Oh, without a doubt, and we saw it not only amongst ourselves, but we share that information with our peer groups. And the challenge, as I said, was knowing the sourcing chain. So you had to be prepared for a failure anywhere in that source chain, and have the appropriate program in place to deal with that, which is all part of risk. And the other thing I think, Atul, is important to mention is what we saw this year in Florida and Texas. I mean, many companies had backups either in Florida and or Texas. Many companies have third level backup site. So these are why we have to be very, very aware of what's going on.
Thanks, John. So I just want to point out to people that hopefully everybody's seeing slides. The slides are live, and sometimes people might have challenges because of the browser that they're using. But if you are not able to see the slides, try to send us a text, and maybe try and check the browser that you are using. And then, one of the other things that we're starting to see, and Mark, feel free to jump in on this, that what started as companies thinking of only a few set of their suppliers as critical has really expanded to companies recognizing that many more suppliers that serve them are actually critical, because in the past, often companies would look at supplier risk from their largest players. But today, there's many small technology players, many small services players that are actually very critical. And so those disruptions can have a significant impact. Mark, have you seen the number of suppliers that one might consider in their risk programs? Have you seen it change as you compare it to maybe 5-10 years ago to today?
Oh, without a doubt. With the theme of outsourcing, growing in relevance and the change in technology, across all, I'm going to say services and product, supply chain, that is absolutely coming into place. And referring back to the slide before as well, a lot of it is why are we here? Understanding the risk. Some of those challenges and those misses, maybe that John referenced, is not having foresight to see them coming and or planning them and fitting them into a model. And awareness not only within, maybe a risk management program such as we run here, but also the business partners and the owners of those risks. That's a complex equation to solve across large corporations. It's not always risk managers such as myself, but it's the business partners and their awareness and experience with outsourcing that drives a number of that.
And Mark and John, we also see that the expectations are rising. So in some industries, the regulators, especially banking, financial services, but also from a governance perspective, we're seeing significant kind of rise in what the board expects, the senior management expects around good practices. John, I know you've dealt with a lot with regulators and also dealing with boards. Any observations here?
Yeah, we in the last probably 3 years, we really noticed a change as regulators started to focus much more on kind of that sourcing chain and supply chain, as Mark mentioned. They asked us to be aware of the piracy, but the regulators in different countries started to look at different things. One of the things we found, for example, in the U.S., the OCC, in a recent guideline to the banks, in a 3-page report, mentioned the word continuous monitoring, the term continuous monitoring, 19 times. I mean, so they're going beyond just doing once a year or every. What are you doing on a regular basis? The other thing they're looking at is they're going to the management boards and asking management boards, do you have an approved sourcing strategy, and how does that sourcing strategy fit in with your business strategy? And then how does that filter down through the different divisions? And I think, Mark, you've probably seen some of that just as well.
Oh, absolutely. And just to piggyback off of that, I mean, if you could look even back to some standard, I'm going to even expand this to independent reviewers and auditors. We all may be aware of like SOC audits or SSAE 16, which is now 18, right? So as of May 1st, even those individual assessments or reports that we hire companies to do for suppliers, risk management program is now becoming part of those independent reviews, and those reports would identify those gaps with the absence of a risk management program. My world specifically, pharmaceutical life cycle and development, right? The GXP regulations, they refer to this third-party oversight, right? Risk-based risk monitoring. How do you have control over your suppliers? So even though they don't quite call it the same name as, say, a banking industry, it's there in a different flavor per se. So it's definitely gaining traction in a number of the regulatory agencies that each of us may work with.
So I think there's a key point that stands out here is this movement towards not just showing that you have risk monitoring, but moving to continuous. And I think one of the questions is, how does one move to continuous? So if you can just wait till our solution, we'll talk about how do you move from periodic monitoring to continuous monitoring, because that's definitely becoming the requirement and very soon will expand beyond the financial services industry. So, it's interesting. I got involved with risk management about 7 years ago and working with a large pharma and a large bank. And one of the things we recognized was that in many companies, and by the way, I've seen this over the last 5 years also, since we've had a solution, that companies have very limited and ad hoc processes where the review cycles are also limited. And some of the common deficiencies that we see is what you are seeing on that list. It's episodic, not continuous. It's reactive when something really bad happens. They depend on the supplier, so they're waiting for the supplier to tell them if something is wrong or something has happened. And they often look at very few risks, maybe just financial risk, and not very much beyond that. Companies, I think, their awareness about cyber risk is definitely rising because of some of the challenges, but often not looking at it beyond that. And one of the biggest challenges that I see in the marketplace is how often when disruptions are happening, they're happening because of what happened in a location. Whether it was a strike, weather, change in the government, really related to a location rather than the supplier itself. And so this lack of real-time and continuous monitoring delays significant action. The other thing we often see is where these risk processes are very individually dependent, they don't have a process. So in one company, in one section, somebody who really gets it, does it really well, but that discipline doesn't extend to the other areas. And in most cases, what's missing is, okay, I know the risk now, but what should I do next? John, Mark, you want to say anything on this before I move to the next slide?
Yeah, real quick on my side, I almost term this slide as it's almost issue management at this point in time, right? So you're very ad hoc and responsive in nature, and part of it is, as we'll see, is within a company, especially the size of the one that I work with, is how do you solve that across business owners, business entities, and functional area responsibilities. So without a model to move forward within any outsourcing engagement to provide to the business and to provide to the corporate players, it's really challenging to move this out the door. And again, that goes back to, I may know my own risk pocket. It might be IT related, but I might not know financial, or I might not know contracting, or I might not know people. So it's very challenging, and the development of that model for outsourcing relationships is just key to get in place, that you can start sharing and educating individuals as you go along.
And regulators, management are starting to look at two different perspectives. They're looking at the supply chain. So when you look at pharmaceutical, for example, there's a very important supply chain that helps Abbvie develop their products. They provide a variety of components and the necessary elements to finish a product. Those have to be checked all along, and they have tolerances, and those tolerances get adjusted based on things that have happened or what they've picked up on the monitoring. When you move to the other side of the business, more the operational side, you then start to look at chain sourcing or source chain. And that means if you're in insurance banking, your data gets sent downstream, and that data that's been entrusted to you now may be handled by numerous others based on contracts you have. And I just saw a question pop up on the screen, and I think it was Mary who said, how do you monitor the ones you don't see? Well, the challenge is that the regulators and the auditors are coming back and saying, you must know every stop in the chain. It's becoming a requirement, which is why risks are mattering more than ever.
And part of that challenge, just to intercept there too, John, is to add to that, part of that is identifying when that is a risk. So if I'm going to send out an RFP as part of the supplier selection and they come back with their outsourcing model per se, that should really be looked at and identified early on as part of that, so that you can actually then assess, okay, I have a third or a fourth party risk here. How do I go ahead and build that into my monitoring or my governance with my direct supplier per se? So part of that challenge is when, and you actually can try to mitigate that and negotiate that as part of the services startup or build it, and or when you're contracting with that supplier to ensure you're covered.
Yeah, Mark and John, that's really good points. As you talk about the extension, and in this case, fourth party risk. And with Mary's question, I understand where that's coming from. And in fact, very soon it'll become a requirement in certain industries. And as Mark said, companies are addressing it at the front end, making sure contractually. In fact, recently, we signed a Supply Wisdom contract with a bank. And as part of signing that contract, in one of the exhibits, we had to identify all our fourth parties that were going to be used in providing services to this bank. So requiring that supply chain visibility, in this case, contractually, and then they are following up with saying, do we monitor those fourth parties And if not, should they be monitored? So asking that next question. And then, of course, the final question is, when risk does change, what do we do? So let's talk about, kind of move from, why risk matters to what risks matter. And what you see in front of you is a proprietary framework that we use at Supply Wisdom, and where it looks at risk. And if you can see, it shows the risk categories for supplier, for location, which is city and country. And you'll notice that the categories are significant, right? It's not just about trying to do a DNB rating to see what the financial risk is, but looking at other components. I'm going to switch to the next slide, and then, John and Mark, it'll be good for you to talk about that as you have looked at risk and think about risk. Talk about why it's important for companies, for risk leaders, sourcing leaders to go beyond financial. And the first 9 categories that you see are specifically around the Supply Wisdom model of supplier risk, those 9 risk categories.
All right, I'll take a shot at this one, and Mark, you can jump in, please.
Absolutely.
So now when you look across these and you start to drill down into the various subcategories that will be used to assess, for example, a supplier risk, one of the things you have to keep in mind when you look at this is, are there other things? Is there other information in here that could be used not only for managing risk, but also for helping other parts of our company? So, for example, someone on our HR teams may be very interested in things that we're tracking, that you may be tracking on from the people risk perspective. Others may look at infrastructure. You might have business people, your partners who are doing, whether it's credit, whether they're thinking of opening a location, whatever that may be, they're going to go look at these categories. So while this overall group is helpful from a vendor risk management and supply managing or governance perspective, it might also help others. So think about, when you look at this, always think about who else in your organization can benefit from this type of information. Mark, over to you.
No, absolutely, and we do take that into account. So, Abbvie gets the Supplier Wisdom report, this corporate overview of that. It's hugely important. When we see that, we also share that, but then we actually take it to the account level, right? So how does this impact my account? Some of these definitions may change at the account level, right? So the company has a financial risk. I may actually take that, or a people risk. Does it impact my account? Does my account have a high attrition risk associated with it or not, right? So some of that, I will take that and I will create a fit-for-use model for my account. Which ones focus on which ones are in play, have the highest risk, the awareness, and actually what John just mentioned, the cross-functional risk here, right? So if I have people risk and financial risk, I may have to bring in other people within my organization. John mentioned a security risk, a third or fourth, sharing of third or fourth party sharing of data. I may have to, look at some of the regulations associated with privacy and stuff and bring that. This definitely drives those account-specific discussions and cross-functional SME involvement with my account.
So when you look at it, as they were talking about, you start to recognize that if I'm going to monitor risk, I need to go beyond my SLAs. I need to go beyond the financial health of that provider. And I have to pay attention to other areas. Is their service maturity rising or declining? Are they investing in a solution or not investing? What about their governance? What kind of management changes have they had? What kind of rules have they changed? Are they buying somebody? What's happening with people? Are they losing people? Are they laying off people? Have they had any lawsuits? Have they had any issues related to their workforce? What about infrastructure? Are they having a higher incident of breaches? Are they banned in certain locations? What kind of, what's happening? Where are they locating their operations? How do they respond when risks happen? Recently there were floods in Chennai. One of the suppliers has 17 centers in Chennai. Their disaster recovery plan had never considered that all 17 centers would not be accessible because of the floods. And guess what? they were not accessible for more than 24 hours because of the flood. What about client risk? Are they gaining more clients, losing clients? What is the reputation of service delivery? What about partners, alliance, thought leadership? Are they continuing to invest in that area? And then what about legal compliance reputation? Were there any lawsuits, any liens, any controversy, any regulatory actions? So you're starting to see the programs that have to be developed. And then the same thing goes, we find at a location level, often companies will put together good programs to monitor their suppliers, but not pay attention to location. Well, what happened in Houston and Jacksonville and Puerto Rico over the last few weeks? Very unfortunate incident that disruptions did not happen because a supplier did something, but it was location issue. Now, you may think about it and say, well, that was very public event, so of course we have those discussions with our suppliers. Guess what? Those events happen globally every day. Weather, politics, law, crime, you name it. Those factors change every day across the world that have an impact on your supplier, that have to do with locations, not with your SLAs. And so we often encourage companies to make sure that they are looking at these kind of risks, that they are looking beyond supplier to looking at location.
And as we said earlier, when you start to use the location component, that helps you then with facilities that you have, that you're internal to your operation. It could be a remote office. It could be a remote process. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a third-party vendor. You can use these locations, as well as we mentioned other units. I've seen travel departments use this information when they're approving executive travel or staff travel. So there's a lot of uses in these things. And there's a tool, and Mark was saying, you don't look at just one thing. Their infrastructure risk might be, but is there something else connected? Because as more categories come into play, you're dealing with maybe an issue that requires multiple solutions, not just one solution. Back to you, Atul.
Another good example would be is the recent H-1B act or law that's been put into place. That's going to make H-1B renewals more difficult. Do you know of your suppliers, people that are on your account? How many of them will go through an H-1B renewal over the next 12 months, next 24 months? Because that risk did not exist 12 months ago, but that risk is real today. So you see how monitoring has to be more comprehensive, and then there's a set of actions that get embedded through a governance program that we will just talk about in about 5 minutes as we go through that. One of the questions that came up was suppliers of suppliers, right, about the fourth-party risk. And the reality is it's really true. This is a group shared assessment that I'm on the board of advisors of for the last 10 years, and John sits on a number of different committees on there. There's a very significant effort being put into third-party oversight around fourth-party risks. And what this shows you is knowing what your risk appetite is, knowing who the third-party providers are, but who are the critical providers to them, and what mechanisms are you putting in place to know who they are, and then being able to monitor and act on it. And you'll see here on this slide, it kind of talks about some of the outsourcing risks, and then it takes it to the next level, which is about what service level risks exist because of that have an impact. Mark, any comments on fourth-party risk before we talk about solutions?
Well, the one that jumped on my mind is you mentioned earlier, contracts a lot of the time may identify, hey, here are me as a supplier, my third parties or fourth parties to me as a client, but active, back to the governance and the oversight of those suppliers. Now we're talking about another level of, way. What are the risks associated with those subcontracted entities? And how is that impacting me as a client? And how do I get in front of that? Again, I'm stepping away and saying this is now for my engagement. I have a contract. It's outside, even bigger than the company itself. At my engagement, how do I identify those risks? How do I mitigate those risks? Do I address it in the contract and or build it into the governance associated with my direct supplier? So very much, again, I started off mentioning the amount of outsourcing of services going on. Fourth-party risk is following suit equally. Outsourcing of an outsourcing or partner or alliance, you can't overlook this anymore. This risk is just growing too much and I greatly appreciate the standalone slide on this. This risk is just going through the roof from a criticality standpoint, and you can't look at it hard enough.
Right.
One of the things we're also seeing is additional risks. Concentration risk now has gone beyond just the traditional concentration risk definitions. Now it's, do you have multiple? How many of your third parties might be using the same fourth party? You have to know what's going on there. And other risk types are coming into play with regulators and senior management and auditors. Things like retained organization risk. If you've sourced a function, have you retained enough knowledge in your organization in the event you have to bring that back or change it? Service readiness. How prepared are you to make a change in case there is a problem? And when you're on the production side, especially like in the pharmaceutical, if one of your key suppliers is in trouble, you have to quickly be able to have another supplier who can pick up that load and get you the products. So those are things that are being considered now more than ever. So the risk categories are also growing.
So let's move to solution. I think, as we're talking about some of these risks, some of the questions that are coming up, there are questions about how do you move from periodic to continuous? What kind of risk should a supplier absorb versus a customer? And there's a few others. So let's do that. I want to make sure we kind of talk about these programs that companies are putting into place. And John, I know this is when you think about risk management program, as you were doing it in the banks we were talking about, you always thought of this as a whole kind of a third-party risk life cycle. Right? Can you kind of take us through that? And then, Mark, I think it'll be good for you to talk about how you think about governance and this life cycle from a risk-based perspective, as you referred to me when we were talking about it last week as risk-based governance. So, John, do you want to start?
Sure. We'll take you through this. If you look at this slide, I think that, to me, there's a lot of very, very solid messages here. But the one that I think we often overlook is there's a little blue arrow on the lower left-hand corner right above the word risk data. And that's the feedback. So as we look at this, you have to develop a strategy and a governance. So you have to have a strategy. As Mark mentioned, you have to have that cross-risk framework, not individual. You have to look at multiple. And then you have to have risk-type controllers. And by that we mean you have to have people who are specialized. So the data privacy people have to help you. The technology people have to help you. Anyone who is a control specialist or subject matter expert needs to be part of kind of the risk governance. And then when you look across the bottom, you'll see that this is where your ratings, your analytics, your reporting, and your governance completed. But that all has to feed back into the front of the program, because the more information you can get at the front of your program, the actual, what we call the procurement portal, as you go through the process, you can then identify and items that are low risk and no risk, you might have straight through processing. But as it becomes more and more, there are more risks associated, a new function, a different function, the degree of your due diligence and your risk assessment has to increase. But so does the ongoing continuous monitoring. You have to track against your risk appetite. Just having it is one thing, but where are you? So if no more than 40% of a supply product can come from one vendor, well, when you're reaching 28, 30, or 35%, do you need to be able to start tracking those? So that's the concept here, is that it is not just individual pieces. It only really works when it all pulls together. And you'll see on the right side is service monitoring, constantly monitoring what is going on across all these and then feeding it back in. Mark, I'll pass it off to you.
Sure. So I'll maybe say the same thing in Abbvie terminology, right? So looking at this chart up front, you mentioned, you had heard me mention finding out the risk up front, right? I call this deal risk. I look at this supplier, what services are they providing? Is it business critical? Is it product critical? Service criticality, data criticality, some of the things that we've seen. Identify the deal risk. And then, back to Atul's comment about governance, right? During the contracting or the transition of those services to the supplier, the utmost importance of building the governance risk-based model into that governance, right? And assign ownerships. I mentioned a diversity of players per se with the outsourcing engagement on the supplier side as well as ours. Building not only the controls, but focusing on what's the highest risk. Not everything is common across the board with outsourcing engagements, whether it's a direct product or a service. Really, I call it fit for use governance. Focus on the highest risk, down to the lowest risk, fit it into your governance strategy, build it, assign ownership. I'm going to say that a lot because that's part of it, who owns risk. And then obviously the ongoing monitoring, the day-to-days. It's more than the SLAs. We call them key risk indicators sometimes on our side. What is my key risk indicator that would be part of my monitoring to flag that this risk is increasing or decreasing? And can you score it? At any given time, can you have a risk scorecard, per se, for the real-time risk monitoring? So the one size does not fit all. We will look at the highest risk for that outsourcing engagement, whether it's data, whether it's personnel, a combination of both. The SLAs are important, operational quality. All of those come into play into our scorecarding program, and you monitor it and you focus on the highest risk. Don't say it's irrelevant, but the lower level risk is something back to your risk appetite. There's a level of where, this is a really small risk. I have the appetite to monitor it less frequently, if at all. So focus on it. Risk-based approach governance is what we term that within Abbvie.
So Mark, if you think about how you're looking at risk today to maybe what you were looking at 3-5 years ago, one of the questions from Sherry that's brought up is, how are you from a staffing perspective or process or tools perspective, how are you keeping up with it? What have you changed over the last few years in terms of being able to keep up with this evolving risks?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the approaches is you heard me term the ownership, right? Not every outsourcing engagement is the same. I might have I might be able to, if I have a tremendously large engagement, business critical, we may have an assigned team for risk management activities. Whereas if it's something that's a smaller project, how do I feed that into the governance? Might not need a separate risk management governance, but I'm going to use maybe a term here on the slide. I might have it as part of one of the strategic committees for that outsourcing engagement, right? I would feed into that, but at least there would be an awareness to that risk. How it actually gets reported and escalated and visibility to it may change within that program or program by program or engagement by engagement. So that is a joint discussion with, hey, the business side of that, who's ever running the operations may inherit it depending on the size of that risk. We may feed it into that committee review or that governance meeting versus a standalone team for larger risk outsourcing engagements. So it's kind of a negotiation based on the risk level for that outsourcing engagement, just sticking to it high, low, medium. Lower ones, there might be a high, say, data criticality or data risk. Even though the entire deal risk might be low, there might be a high level of data risk associated with that. So how can I not lose sight of that high level of data risk and feed it into the governance without having myself, for example, having to take that on for all outsourcing engagements? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think based on what you've heard, there's many of us that concur that a solution that needs to be something that companies can implement very quickly. This is not about a 2-year program to build a system, something that can be configured because the needs, as both John and Mark were talking about, depending on what the role within the company is, they have different needs. The risk framework, the risk that it covers need to be comprehensive, well beyond financial and cyber, as we looked into the models. And it needs to be real-time continuous. It needs to be proven in the sense by industry, by verticals. And of course, it needs to be cost-effective. Whether it leverages automation or not, we know that by leveraging automation, it can improve accuracy, productivity, and of course, can be cost-effective. So our recommendation to companies is that when you think about a certain solution regarding risk monitoring, you need to have a system where you can access risk data. So you understand what that risk is. You need a system that has some kind of an alerting mechanism, that when risk changes, that the right relevant parties have to be notified, that they have to have some guidance on what are the set of actions that need to be taken. And as Mark was talking about, there has to be a scorecard. There has to be a portfolio approach where you can look at it and be able to understand the health of your supply base, your third-party program. And so what we end up, kind of thinking about, and again, John and Mark, feel free to jump in, is when you have a real-time continuous system, you would have alerts that are able to be delivered to the right people, that help those right people understand what kind of risk it is, what is the severity of that risk. It tells them on what kind of actions they should be taking. It can be distributed within the company and shared very quickly, also with the partners, and that people are able to add their comments to it, right? That they're able to share their knowledge. So if Mark is sharing an alert internally with the business users, Mark should be able to write his comments, share his comments. So the company is seeing not just market information, but Mark's kind of wisdom in terms of what he thinks the impact of the company is. So that, to us, is one of the first components of a good solution. I'm going to pause right there just to see if Mark or John have any kind of comments.
Yeah, I think priority number one, Atul, to piggyback off that alert, being aware of the alert and the changes that are driving, having that built in to a governance, even if it's the business. Hey, I think somebody brought up, we had a call about the RPA, right? Something that was not, that's actually a similar service out, but I'm using a different technology to complete that. RPA has different risk associated than doing it manual per se, right? So that having that alert and awareness, and then that communication. Right now, even if it's email in some cases, right? At least it's getting through the governance and communications versus it documented in a governance software application per se. Critical just to get it out there and being able to get it to the right stakeholders and the correct inputs being forthcoming out of that communication.
And another good component of a solution becomes data, because one needs to be able to understand trends. One needs to understand trends in terms of where are those trends changing, where increased attention needs to be paid. If you go back to Mark's and John's comment about risk-based governance, that's exactly what you need to be able to see, is what is changing so you can compare and act on it. And then finally, a scoreboard, right? I think that's how effective programs are that allow you to provide or get a very quick look into where things stand, what is changing. And Mark, I think maybe wants to comment on this further, but I think it's important to recognize is that these components need to exist that now enable you to take action that is specific to your environment. This is market information that now feeds into very specific actions.
Yes, having this information to go back to, again, the engagement owner. I mean, sometimes I have, the size of our corporation, I may have a dozen different business owners sharing the same supplier, right? So having that voice from this system in taking that risk, is it in play with a number of them, their SOWs or their engagement contracts or the others, taking it, being able to take this to them, address it at the account level? Is it a high risk? Yes, mitigate. Is it part of a lower risk? Does it matter to my account? Tremendously value add to be able to take that back to the business owners. It's a third-party voice and data-driven analytics that goes back for those decision-making processes. We actually feed this scorecard into, again, I say engagement-specific scorecards. Not everything that's flagged here might be relevant to all of my accounts, but some of it is, right? This is a key risk indicator that goes into that account level risk management program. If it flags red and it looks like it's being impacted on our account, immediately I should have a governance avenue to escalate and start looking at mitigating that risk with respect to that account with the suppliers.
You can also use historical data I was going to say to look for trends. In other words, if an incident happens or something occurs, you can actually take that for that vendor, that location, whatever, and look back over 6 months, a year, or 18 months, and see if there was a trend in how things moved that led up to that. So again, that helps you in the world of pattern matching, which is becoming another important part of risk assessment.
Yeah. And I think, Mark made a really important point, right? So you need to have these programs, and hopefully you see the components that enable you to go from periodic to continuous. And there's an effort behind it, right? I mean, so we made it into our business, right? We made Supply Wisdom as the service solution that enables you to do that. But, there are companies out there that do this on their own, large banks, for example, where you put these components in place. But at the end of it, you do need to tie it with engagement-specific governance, right? So these are actions you take. What should be on the agenda when I walk into the next governance meeting or when I have this call this morning with my partners, right? You want to understand how are they acting when some of these risks change. There are a few questions, by the way, that are coming up, I'm going to take on the questions, but I want to make a final point is that these programs require sustainability. And what we mean by that is you can't just do this as a one-time assessment. They need to be sustained, right? That's what we mean by real-time and continuous, that they are happening. These practices are being put into place as a forever ongoing virtuous cycle, right? It's about the initial assessment, ongoing reviews, ongoing monitoring, governance actions, then that feed back to this risk-based governance in terms of what should I be managing, what should I be monitoring? Mark, one of the questions that's being asked is, are you seeing a reduction in number of suppliers because of risk monitoring? What other impacts are you seeing on the supplier base because of this risk monitoring?
Yeah, so what I would say is I don't think a number of suppliers being proposed is ever going to, with the change in technology that's happening, the global outsourcing initiatives that are going. So right now there is probably an increase in suppliers being proposed, but there is and again I'm going to say just because I don't know the math with the amount of outsourcing going out versus historical, but I would say there is a reduction in the decentralization of those suppliers, if that makes sense, right, for potentially the same services. Taking those in, identifying those risks up front, just can't emphasize that enough, go into the supplier selection process, right? That is a huge opportunity, right? So I'm just sharing this. I'd love to use the word opportunity with risk management at that point in time, because it not only identifies maybe it's the data risk, maybe it's the regional geographical risk that was brought up, maybe it's other. You can use that to your advantage during the negotiations. Is it a technology shortcoming, decision-based risk, and it's an opportunity to build with your supplier as part of that selection and contracting process. So hopefully that answers the question. Lots of suppliers, reduced amount of decentralization per se.
Yeah. So I think, in our observation, we see something similar. In some cases, people expand suppliers because they recognize the risk that exists. The technology space is changing. That's leading to addition of suppliers. And there are definitely areas where companies will reduce suppliers in mature products and services because they don't need the governance risk of multiple suppliers, and they may narrow down to just a few suppliers. One of the other questions from the audience is, are you aware of any increase in the scope of SSAE 16 or ISAE 3402 to address increased risk management? It's like the old SOX, I guess. Are you aware of any increase of that to address more risk management?
So I briefly mentioned SSAE 16. It's now being replaced. I may have the date wrong here, but May 1st this past year, 17. That's replaced with SAE 18, right? So there are a number of, back to, I think in the slides I saw quality checks or assessment checks. That does come into play. And, what's the difference between the 16 and 18 is the risk management, third-party risk management. They have to have those suppliers are being looked at for their risk management program themselves, back to our fourth-party risk and whatnot. So reliance on those, that is a great avenue. I use it as an independent third parties look at a supplier and or their sites, performing those services to give me a high level. It goes into my risk scorecard, for example, right? Does this supplier and this site, are they covered by said independent third-party review? Saves me from doing some of the work, for sure, that risk management cadence, per se. But so risk management is being brought into those, back to the other regulations, and the OCC reference made earlier definitely coming into play more and more.
So there's a good question. We're coming to almost the end of our webinar, so I know there's probably one more question we can address, and then I do want to assure everybody that the recording, including the presentation, will be available to you. So we'll make sure you get a PDF of that. One of the questions is about specific resource shortages. So instead of answering the question, I think this just reaffirms the point that often we ought to be monitoring some of these things also, right? Which is, right now, for example, if you're doing automation programs, AI-related programs, there's a shortage of resources, right? So that should be identified as a risk. And then from a monitoring perspective, you would monitor the suppliers to understand who is building capabilities faster than the others. Who should I be working with? And once you're working with them, how do you make sure you are the client of choice, that you get the attention? What should you be doing from a contracting perspective, monitoring perspective, governance perspective, that you are actually the client of choice? So I hope it's okay with everybody, because I think I think there's a lot of energy around this. And one of the things that I want to suggest to everybody is that don't hesitate to send your questions to Sherry. The Voice of the Customer group, I think you see Sherry's email and phone number on here. Send her your questions, and we will be, Mark, John, and I will be more than happy to answer those. And also, if you are a corporate member or want to become a corporate member and interested in Supply Wisdom, join the webinar on November 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and you'll get to hear this IOP corporate member benefit. But there's also some great, material out there. And, we've collected a lot of material in terms of what's happening in the third-party space. And if anybody's interested, please reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to provide you additional information in this area. Sherry, I want to thank, on behalf of Mark, John, and I, first of all, Mark and John, I want to thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. I think it was extremely informative. And then Sherry, I want to thank the Voice of the Customer chapter for giving the governance chapter and us as members an opportunity to share what we are seeing and what we are experiencing in the third-party supplier risk space, especially continuous and real-time monitoring.
We definitely appreciate your input today, because this was one of those burning topics at OWS 17, and we needed some information. So thank you very much for helping us out, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this next February also. It's not going to go away.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. We look forward to hearing from you.
Bye now.